Local 514's host Savannah Craig interviewed Catherine Lussier of the Front d'Action Populaire en Réaménagement Urbain. Lussier and Craig discussed the type of situations that tenants face when standing up for their rights and ways to mobilize in Montreal. Stay tuned for the whole interview.
Catherine Lussier, and I'm a community organizer at FRAPRU.
Thanks, Catherine. So could you tell me a little bit about what can tenants experience in Montreal when, when they stand up for their rights?
Some of them will receive intimidation and harassment even before they try to do something, which will lead to them to discourage them to use any type of measure and just prefer moving to not having too much trouble. So I think there is tenants that will defend their rights, and sometimes it starts just because they refuse the rent increase, and then the landlord will start not doing any repairs and then mentioning it every time, but you're not paying enough, or you refuse the rent increase, and then putting more and more pressure on them. So sometimes it will also look like a lot of calls. They will knock their door many times. They will, try to force them to sign something without they even have time to read it, or consult someone to be sure that they, what is the content of the letter. They will also not leave them or give them any notice. So they will force them to sign, and then they will not give them back anything. There is a different method that we have seen also, like cutting water or cutting eating, to try to force kind of tenants to move out. But most of the time it's because also some tenants are resistant. In the case of Renault eviction, we've seen the traditional, you refuse to move, then I'm going to destroy everything around you until it's neither livable for you or neither livable in sense of noise and dust and everything, that you will force the person to go out, even if they have fought for their rights and then they have the right to stay. They will use this, we're repairing all the rest of the building where tenants actually have moved to, you force them to move out. So I know it happened a lot in the Plateau Mont Royal, when you're like 3 or 4 tenants left. And then when they destroy most of the building, they will call the fire department, and they will, the fire department will come, and then they will see that it's dangerous to stay there, so they will evict the tenants or move them out of the building. So it really goes to a wide range of the landlord calling them. Like recently, a woman told me they called me 10 times to accept the rent increase, as some landlord cutting water, entering in their apartment without them giving the right to, forcing them the letters. Some tenants have noticed that sometimes landlords stealing their mail. So it goes to a really wide range. Obviously, you have also the more violent behavior, like the landlord that will shout at them. I had also some tenants before that told me that they refused to sign, and then the landlord like trashed them back their money for the rent, and then it was like, I refuse to take your money. So this is also another strategy for landlords. Sometimes it's like they will stop taking the rent. They will refuse any type of way for them to accept the rent, refuse to go get the letters, the formal notice. They know that they're getting a registered mail, so they're not going to the post office. So the tenants have to find another way to send the notice. So there is really this wide range of like landlord strategy that they will use for actually. And obviously the harassment and intimidation, the harassment in the law is like, a lot of little behaviors on a long-term period of time. That is the reason, is to force them to move out. So it needs, the logic behind is like they want them to move out, and then they will use all this little strategy over time to just, exhaust the tenant, and then tenants would rather move then. And then obviously you can complain to the rental board for harassment, intimidation. But yeah, we've seen some tenants, having really fear of their landlord or the manager of the building, because of different intimidation, or sometimes they will having violent behavior. I don't have a lot of tenants that have actually mentioned being hit, but sometimes it goes up to, landlord calling the police because they say, you were violent toward me. But it's not most of the cases. It's more other type of behavior, but that leads to exhaustion of tenants, not necessarily mentally of fighting these.
When you said about landlords not accepting the rent, is that a strategy so that the landlord can go to the town and say, well, they're not paying, and that's the ability to kind of evict them?
Yeah, that's definitely the reason why they most of the time refuse to rent is because they want them to move. So they will actually use that against the tenants and then open a file. And obviously, it takes more time. It's a really easier way than saying the tenants is disruptive or anything. It's easy to get evicted for that reason. So the saddest cases is when tenants, for example, already low income that are struggling every month, and the landlord doesn't pick up the rent, and then okay, I have this to pay, so I will pay it, and then when they arrive to these types of hearing, they don't have actually the money to pay them. Then they will get evicted for because the landlord didn't collect it, or some other landlord will use any little thing that happened, like in 1975, you actually didn't pay your rent on time, and then they will use that to try to evict them, and they will put pressure a lot on the tenants, by saying, "But I can evict you. You didn't pay your rent." Or
Thank you for explaining this. I know you mentioned a wide variety of situation, but in any of these scenarios that you listed, is there anything that FRAPRU was able to do, or any support that you guys can give to tenants?
the support comes mostly from the housing committee because it's part of their service and part of their job to support tenants individually. When I was working for Cape, for example, the action committee of park extension, that was thing that was done. For example, sometimes reuniting when it was built buildings, tenants together, um, so they can fight back, or at least they don't feel alone with these types of situations. So it's really more the housing committee that are actually in the middle of all the situation more than we are at FRAPRU. Obviously, some tenants are calling us, especially when we arrive at the renewal moment of the year and saying, okay, I want to move. And so they call us because they think we can have a solution for them moving. And then they start telling us, oh yeah, but it's for that reason, my landlord didn't refuse to repairs, and then some of them is like, yeah, I'm leaving actually a situation. So they will actually tell us, but in our case, we don't have a lot of possibility. Obviously, our best possibility is to fight so social housing exists, so people don't have to live this types of situation. So by living in a co-op or non-profit organization that has for mission housing people, and not having this mission of profit, or so that's more our range is like more overall that we need to fight for having more social housing units to protect people from these types of behaviors.
Thank you. Um, uh, is I know this is a silly question, but I want to ask it anyway. Is there any way that tenants can mobilize, or stand up for their rights a certain way to prevent these intimidation tactics, or is any tenant at risk no matter what they do? It just depends on the landlord.
It's a hard question because I think there is a part that is like personality of the landlord. Obviously, and we've seen cases by the past of really abusive landlord. Some of these landlords that doesn't believe that rules are made for them. Like we have seen different cases, and sometimes on repairs, and then the city condemned their. I don't remember the name, but it was not Lussier in Park X. It was like the Roi di Tutsi, and it was this types of behavior that could lead to this abusive landlord. um, and the other little strategy is, I think, like when you're not alone as a tenant is giving you more power, and the power of not being alone in that situation. So when it's possible, because if you live in a duplex or a triplex, sometimes you're not that many, but in to be together in the fight. I think I've seen that being or giving a difference on the tenants, that when, especially if you're little tenants all together to fight for your rights, and then you're also together and fighting back from this behavior, and also you will get the support of the housing committee. I think that could be strategy, at least that you don't feel alone living it. It might not reduce what you're living at a direct point, but you will not be alone living it. And that could make a difference of how much this behavior could affect you or affect the tenants, mentally, physically, because it's a high situation of stress when someone is living it daily. And living it alone daily, it's also a high situation of stress. There is some landlord that, because you're not alone, and because you will be backed up by sometimes lawyers or sometimes housing committee, that could maybe back up a bit, or be more careful of what they're saying. It really depends of some of the landlord or companies, I think, that we've seen. But that could make a difference, at least that you're not alone with your problem, and then making it more a collective issue with all the tenants that are living the same situation. Then you could lead to at least putting more pressure of like, this is not correct, and also could give more emphasis of what, if you go to the rental board for saying I'm living intimidation, I'm living harassment, and if you're like 10 or 15 tenants to go for the same landlord in the same building, I think it could also give a straight up for your demand to be considered, like that you're not lying, and then the proofs are there for saying like, okay, you're the fifth tenants I'm seeing today that has exactly the same problem, exactly the same type of proof, and that could also make stronger their case, and then you have more people coming to speak on also on your behalf. So I think that could make a difference of not feeling alone. That's what some tenants were telling us, or when I was in Parkex, um, that they feel that they're supported, that they're not alone in front of that situation. And sometimes it leads to be more listened. And I think if you go sometimes in the medias, in the news, with this type of situation, to denounce them, it could maybe also lead to maybe some landlord backing off because of their reputation, that they don't want to be affected by that also. So that could be another strategy that could be used.
Thank you. And then I wanted to ask, should tenants before, when they're looking for an apartment or before they sign on, should they maybe like research? I know it's not foolproof, but research their potential landlord, to see if there's anything that's been said about them, or even if they do this, is just the lack of available units preventing people from being able to be picky?
I think, yeah, your second part of your question answered. Right now, in this situation we're living, actually, a lot of people don't have the choices. Even if they make research and they notice a landlord have evict everyone in the building before them, what is the choice of that tenant of saying, no, I'm not going to live there because I'm pretty sure it's going to be abusive? Or there's not a lot of choices right now. The prices are like in spike. Landlords are discriminating as ever. Maybe not as stronger at other times, but there are actually a lot of discrimination. So it's hard to say just research and refuse to live in a place like this. I think we need to continue to fight that regulation doesn't allow them. Regulation and the rental board act, or the housing tribunal, the housing court act faster for these types of situations, that they're not going to put in general causes, and then in 2 years, after you've been living 2 years in this nightmare, that they take consideration of what you're living. I think there is things that needs to change before we're just telling to the tenants, oh, you should be careful of what landlord you're renting your apartment to, especially in a situation where they don't have the choices. We're lacking of social housing units. You cannot just arrive in a co-op or arrive in a nonprofit and find an apartment that you will be able to stay and say, okay, at least my landlord should not use this strategy. So in the perfect and ideal world, yes, but that's not the world we're living in, and there's things that should be done to condemn these landlords before the tenants has to make actually a different choice.
Thank you so much. And lastly, I just want to ask, are there enough laws in place that protect tenants in Montreal and Quebec? And if there are enough laws in place, are they not being upheld?
There is some laws in place. I think there could probably be better protection for tenants that are living these types of situation. Obviously, we're considering that the punitive damage in these situations are actually ridiculous. There is no real consequences for landlord that will use abusive measure, even forcing someone to quit, or because they didn't, they didn't accept the increase. There is no real consequences, and when you look what is giving as a punitive damage is like thousands, $1,000, $2,000. So if you're, some of the landlord or corporation, this is mean nothing. Even if the tenants go to all the trouble, the years of waiting to collect the data, to build its case is not strong enough to discourage landlords to use this strategy. And I think we're seeing it more and more now, like the acceleration of these users of strategy for forcing tenants to get out of their apartment. It's a proof that the laws in place are actually too weak for really protecting tenants. So there's better laws that needs to be put in place, and there are also better, consequences through punitive damage. That punitive damage should be given more systematically, not just in harassment cases, because as we've seen, sometimes you will open a case because the landlord is evicting you, but this is the another time, or it's another consequences of all the harassment that is being put on the tenant because you want him to move. So you will try all the fucking strategy possible, like one after the other one. But then you have to prove that this is harassment. And after that, maybe you're never going to get punitive damage for it. So they're not really used or systematically used in these types of situations. And they need to be higher, obviously. And after, I think, is all the other protection to protect tenants better, the waiting time, the access to justice, like access to lawyers. Some tenants will actually not have access to justice, and sometimes it could make the difference for them to not feel alone and feel that they have a real, real way to negotiate with the landlord in a way. It's not going to be perfect in every sense. We're still dealing with individual that thinks that they're over the law sometimes. But yeah, there is a better protection that needs to be done. But for us, it's like all the wide changes that we've been mentioning of like the rental board, in case of the rental board, and all these. I think it needs to pass by the court, but and maybe there is something criminally that could be introduced to also, have another way to punish this type of behavior. And that, unfortunately, for tenants that try to go towards the police when they feel that they're harassed, some tenants will receive up to death threats, but sometimes they're not. They will be considered, because as landlord tenants immediately as a civil cause, and they will say, okay, you have to go with the tribunal, the housing court, but at the same time, he still has received death threats. So most of the time, the police in Montreal will not necessarily put them as a something criminal. They will directly consider them as civil cause, so they're not going to act. So maybe there is something in the digital system that could be done, maybe also to have a strong punishment for these types of landlord, because at the end it's affecting a lot of lives if we mention it like this. But that's just, we don't have any strong proposition in that sense, but I'm just quite thinking it.
Thank you. I just had one more question. If we want more laws, the laws that we have to be upheld, go further, what can we do? Like, is there a certain party that represents the values that FRAPRU pushes for, or is, things like mobilizing protests, just anything that we can do?
Obviously, as the RECLAC is asking, I think there is really a real reform that needs to be done by the tribunal. First, to see the causes faster, but we have complexified the capacity or the possibility of opening a case at the housing court. It doesn't help in this type of situation, because you need to depose all the proof for opening your case, and then in this case, that it could be really a lot of things that will have happened that you bring into the rental board. So there is something that needs to be faster in the process, and then need the housing court to be reformed. We has the reclac, like we consider that this is one of the thing that needs to be done. Obviously, for us, there is not necessarily a political party that has spoke or have like positions strong, but for us it passed truly by giving all the resources necessary. And I think we have seen it, like the reclac make a press release with the syndicate of the workers at the housing court, of saying like how much they don't keep the personal, people are moving, there is not a lot for answering, and then it's super hard to just reach them. So there is a resource also, like the Quebec government needs to give all the possible resource so it goes faster. We need to prioritize also these types of cases, but at the same time, first we consider that you should not be waiting 2 years, so we should be able to be faster with the demands up opening, and like treating them like this and not having to wait too much time for these types of case. So a big part of it could pass by the rental board, and the rental board, just because there is no specific law prohibiting the judges to go over what has been done in the decision, to go and give punitive damage. It is possible to give more punitive damage at the tribunal, so it needs to be used actually in the court. So it could be directive. Is it necessary to have a new law that would specify how much you can get? But maybe it could help to come and, with this types of behavior, you necessarily have to get this punitive damage. And in this case, it could be the law, but it could be also more systematically at the judge at the tribunal court that would, put the punitive damage.
Thank you. Is there anything
Obviously,
that
it is less what I'm speaking every day about it, because obviously for us it's also passed by social housing units, and then we need to develop more social housing units and protect tenants, removing them from the private sector. But because in that case, when this nonprofit organization, when there is different lever that you have if these types of things happen, and you normally don't have a whole organization that will actually harass a tenant, there is possibility for negotiation. There's possibility to speaking most of the time if there is some trouble specifically. The same in co-op. So it's well, it's managed between themselves. So for us, it's also removing as much as possible these types of buildings from the market, and socialize them. That will also secure a long-term period, a place to stay for tenants, and avoiding these types of actually strategies that could be used.
Thank you. Is there anything that I didn't ask that is important you'd like to mention?
No, I think I covered it all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to speak.